She had been teaching for years, a dedicated educator who believed in the power of knowledge to change lives, but nothing could have prepared her for what she was about to uncover. It started with a quiet conversation in the staff lounge, a place where teachers usually found solace from the chaos of the classroom. But that day, the air was thick with tension. Two colleagues were whispering, their faces etched with concern. At first, she thought it was just the usual school gossip. But then one of them said something that made her blood run cold. "The budget cuts are worse than they're telling us. They're going to close down the special needs program next year." For a moment, the room went silent. It wasn't just a whisper. This was real. A decision was being made behind closed doors, and it would hurt the students who needed it most. Her heart raced as she pieced together the fragments of the conversation. She had always known the system was flawed, but this was something else. The school, the one she had worked at for over a decade, was making cuts that would directly impact the most vulnerable children. She couldn't believe it. How could they take away resources for kids who were already struggling? She had seen firsthand how these programs gave students a chance to thrive, students who, without support, would fall through the cracks. But now, it seemed like those cracks were widening. But she wasn't just going to sit back and let it happen. She knew something had to be done. So, she started digging. Late at night, when the classroom lights were off and the rest of the school was silent, she scoured the budget reports, looking for any sign of what was really going on. She found it, hidden in the fine print. Millions of dollars were being funneled into administrative salaries, while the programs that actually helped students were being slashed. It was a betrayal. She felt it deep in her gut. And it wasn't just about the budget cuts. It was about the system itself, how it prioritized everything except the students who needed it most. But this teacher wasn't one to back down. She had seen too many children struggle, too many bright futures crushed by the system's indifference. The next day, she made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't just stay silent any longer. She had to speak out. But what happened next would shock not just her, but everyone around her. She never expected the system to react the way it did. She thought, if anything, the truth would set her free, that people would rally around her cause. She thought it was just a matter of telling the truth and letting others see the injustice. But what she uncovered was something far darker. The moment she spoke up, the school went on the defensive. They silenced her. Not with words, but with consequences. First, they moved her to a different classroom, away from the students she loved. Then they began to question her dedication, her methods. They even tried to paint her as the problem, as if she were the one causing the disruption. And yet, despite all of this, she didn't back down. She knew the students were counting on her. So she decided to do what no one else was willing to do. She went public. The truth, as it turned out, wasn't something the school wanted to hear. She began to speak with local news outlets, revealing the details of the cuts and how they were hurting the kids. But that was only the beginning. Her words spread like wildfire. What started as a small whisper in the staff lounge had turned into a full-blown movement. Other teachers, parents, and even students began to rally behind her. The community was outraged. They couldn't believe it. How could the school prioritize everything except the kids who needed help? But just as the pressure began to mount, something unexpected happened. The school board, faced with mounting public backlash, agreed to meet with her. It was a rare move. In the world of education, those in power didn't usually back down so easily. They had their systems in place, their policies, and they rarely budged. But the outrage from the community was undeniable. As she walked into that meeting, she was nervous, but determined. This was her chance to make a real difference. The stakes couldn't have been higher. She was about to face off with the very people who had tried to silence her. But what happened next would change everything. She didn't expect to get an apology, nor did she think they'd admit to the wrong they had done. But what they offered her was something even more shocking. What she didn't know, as she sat across from those decision-makers, was that they had already made a plan that no one saw coming. And when the truth finally came out, it wasn't just the school that would be held accountable. The entire education system, one that she had spent her life working within, would be forced to change. As she sat there, waiting for the meeting to begin, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a conversation. It was a turning point. She had expected them to dismiss her, to throw her concerns aside like they had done countless times before. But what she didn't expect was the level of fear that seemed to hang in the room. The school board members were visibly uncomfortable, shifting in their seats as if they had been caught in the act of something they couldn't explain away. And then it happened. One of them, a senior board member, someone she had always seen as part of the establishment, spoke up. "We've been following the public response to the issue," he began, his voice shaky. "And we've realized that maybe we haven't done enough to listen to the voices that matter." Her heart raced. Was he actually admitting fault? Was he acknowledging the truth of what she had been saying all along? She had to keep her composure, but inside she felt a spark of hope. Could this be the breakthrough she had been waiting for? But before she could respond, another board member cut in. "The situation is more complicated than you understand," he said, his tone defensive. "We don't have the resources to fix everything overnight. There are legal and financial constraints, things you probably don't see from your classroom." Her blood boiled. She had seen the numbers. She knew where the money was going, but she couldn't back down now. "You don't get to hide behind budgets and policies when children are suffering," she said, her voice steady but fierce. "These aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. These are kids' lives. And you're telling me you don't have the resources to give them a chance?" The room fell silent. She could see the unease spreading across the faces of the board members. They were used to people coming in, complaining, and then walking out when nothing changed. But this time was different. She wasn't going to let them brush her off. The senior board member who had spoken earlier seemed to hesitate, then leaned forward. "We've already started making changes," he said slowly, almost as if he was testing the waters. "We're reallocating funds to increase support for special needs programs, and we're working on improving transparency with the public. But it's going to take time." Her mind raced. It wasn't enough. She had spent too long watching as the system failed the kids who needed it the most. But it was a start. The question was, could it be enough to make a real difference? She didn't want to settle for promises, not anymore. "Time," she said, her voice firm, "is a luxury these kids don't have. If you truly want to fix this, you need to act now. You need to show this community that you're willing to do what's right, not just what's easy." The tension in the room was palpable. For a moment, no one spoke. It felt as if the fate of those programs and the future of countless children was hanging in the balance. And then the most unexpected thing happened. The school board member who had been the most defensive, the one who had questioned her the most, leaned back in his chair and sighed. "You're right," he said quietly, almost as if he was conceding defeat. "It's not enough. We've failed these kids." She stared at him in shock. Was this the same person who had just hours ago tried to deflect responsibility? She had expected the usual corporate speak, the evasive language designed to make it seem like they were doing enough, when they weren't. But this was different. "Here's what we're going to do," he continued, his voice more resolute now. "We will immediately freeze all non-essential administrative expenses. We'll funnel that money directly into the programs you've been advocating for, and we'll start a series of town hall meetings where parents, teachers, and students can have a say in the budget process going forward." For the first time in weeks, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. This was it. The change she had fought so hard for was finally within reach. But as the meeting came to a close, she couldn't help but feel a deep unease. Was this just a temporary fix, or would they truly follow through? The next few months would tell the real story. But what happened next would take her by surprise in ways she never imagined. Days after the meeting, the school began making the promised changes. The special needs program was not only saved, but expanded. Teachers were finally given the resources they needed to succeed in their classrooms. The community began to come together, stronger than ever. Parents, students, and educators united to demand better, to demand change. It felt like a victory, but it was still early. Then the phone rang. It was the local news station. They wanted to do a feature on her. The teacher who had stood up when everyone else stayed silent. She agreed, but what she didn't know was that the story would soon spread far beyond her small town. The headlines would soon read, "Teacher exposes systemic injustice and wins." People across the country were watching. Her story was going viral. And that's when the real change began. The pressure from the public didn't just force the school to act. It sent ripples through the entire education system. Other schools, districts, and even states began to take note. The world was watching, and the movement was only just beginning. Her decision to speak out, to expose the truth, had sparked something bigger than she could have ever imagined. The question now was, would the world listen, or would this moment fade into another forgotten story? Only time would tell. The phone calls kept coming. News stations, education advocates, and even politicians were reaching out to her. Her inbox was flooded with messages of support, but also with something else. Questions. They wanted to know how she managed to stand up in a system that seemed designed to silence those who challenged it. How had she found the courage to speak out when everything was stacked against her? But what no one seemed to realize was that the courage didn't come from a place of certainty. It came from desperation. She had watched too many of her students fall through the cracks, too many bright futures dimmed by a system that didn't seem to care. The fight wasn't about her. It was about them. It was about those kids, the ones who were always forgotten, always last in line. She had seen the impact firsthand. Children who had been written off, ignored, or worse, discarded as lost causes. That was the real injustice. As the spotlight on her grew, so did the pressure. Some people praised her, calling her a hero, but there were also those who tried to discredit her. The same system that had tried to silence her now began to fight back in other ways. Anonymous letters, subtle threats, and even smear campaigns were launched, trying to paint her as a troublemaker rather than a whistleblower. But she wasn't backing down. She couldn't. Not when the stakes were this high. The truth had come out, and now there was no turning back. She had uncovered the cracks in the system, and the more people saw them, the more they demanded change. And it wasn't just local. Her story had caught the attention of educators across the country, sparking a nationwide conversation about the state of education and the disparity between wealthy and underfunded schools. The pressure on lawmakers to act was growing stronger by the day. What started as a small movement in one town was beginning to snowball into something much larger. Then, one morning, she received an email that would change everything. It was from a well-known non-profit organization focused on educational reform. They had been following her story, and they wanted to collaborate. The email spoke of a nationwide campaign, a movement to push for legislation that would directly address the inequities she had exposed. It was an offer that no one in her position could ignore. As the campaign began to gain momentum, she found herself speaking at rallies, engaging with politicians, and becoming the face of something far bigger than herself. The fight for education reform had become her life's mission, but with every step forward, the stakes got higher. She had to keep pushing, keep fighting, even when the odds seemed impossible. It was at one of these rallies that she met someone who would change the course of the campaign, a powerful congresswoman who had been following the movement from the beginning. The congresswoman was known for her bold stance on social justice and had been a fierce advocate for education reform for years. When they met, the connection was immediate. She saw in the congresswoman not just an ally, but a powerful voice who could amplify the movement's message. Together they began to strategize, planning for the long fight ahead. They knew that the battle wouldn't be won overnight, but they were determined to see it through. The congresswoman had the political influence and resources that could turn this local fight into a national one. She wasn't just a teacher anymore. She was a leader of a movement that could change the future of education for millions of children. The campaign for education reform took off. What had once been a fight for a small-town special needs program was now a national conversation. Parents, teachers, students, and advocates rallied behind her, demanding that lawmakers prioritize children's needs over bureaucracy. The push for new legislation became a focal point of the upcoming election cycle, and suddenly the politicians who had once ignored her were now seeking her out, hoping to align themselves with the movement she had ignited. But as the movement grew, so did the challenges. The deeper she got into the political landscape, the more she saw how complicated and entrenched the issues truly were. The promises of change came with strings attached. Some politicians, sensing the growing wave of public support, tried to use her cause for their own gain. Others, fearing the disruption of the status quo, began to fight back in subtle ways, blocking bills, spreading misinformation, and trying to undermine the campaign at every turn. It was a fight on all fronts now, not just against the outdated system, but also against the people who benefited from it. But she wasn't deterred. She had come too far to let it slip away now. The final push came when the new education bill was introduced. The legislation wasn't perfect, but it was a step forward. It included provisions for better funding for special needs programs, more transparency in school budgets, and greater accountability for schools in underserved communities. It wasn't everything she had dreamed of, but it was a start. The day the bill passed was a day she would never forget. She had been in the trenches, battling every obstacle, facing every setback. But now, as she stood before a crowd of teachers, students, and parents who had joined her fight, she felt a deep sense of accomplishment. It wasn't just a win for her, it was a win for every student who had ever been told they didn't matter. For every child who had been left behind, she had exposed the injustice, she had fought the system, and in the end, she had won. But as she left that rally, her phone buzzed with another message. A new challenge was on the horizon. The fight for education reform wasn't over. It had only just begun. And this teacher, the one who had once been just a quiet voice in the classroom, was ready to continue the battle. Because she knew that change wasn't just about one victory, it was about an ongoing, relentless pursuit of justice. And she would keep fighting for as long as it took. The months after the victory were a whirlwind of new opportunities and new challenges. The movement had gained such traction that people from all walks of life were reaching out to her. Parents, teachers, activists, even students, all wanted to be a part of something that was bigger than themselves. She had become not just a figurehead, but a symbol of hope, of a chance at real change. But with that newfound status came a darker side. As her influence grew, so did the backlash. The very same people who had ignored the calls for reform now feared what her success could mean for their careers and agendas. The wealthy donors, the lobbyists, and the corporate interests who had thrived in a broken system began to mount an opposition. They whispered behind closed doors, pulling strings to undermine her every move. At first the attacks were subtle. They spread rumors, discredited her work, and questioned her motives. They tried to paint her as someone who didn't understand the complexities of the system, someone out of touch with the real problems facing education. But these attacks only strengthened her resolve. She had been in the trenches for years. She knew the game. She wouldn't let these powers intimidate her now. The pressure began to take its toll. The sleepless nights, the constant media attention, and the never-ending battle against the forces that wanted to maintain the status quo were exhausting. She found herself in uncharted territory, unsure of who she could trust. Even within the movement, cracks began to form. Some of the new allies she had gained started pushing their own agendas, taking the movement in directions she hadn't intended. Some wanted to shift the focus from education to other social issues, while others were eager to claim credit for the progress that had been made. The balance between the cause and the chaos of a growing political platform was fragile. But as she sat in her office, reviewing the next steps in the campaign, she received a message that made her pause. It was from one of her former students, someone she hadn't heard from in years. The message was brief but powerful. "Thank you for fighting for us. Because of you, I'm going to college." Tears welled up in her eyes as she read the message over and over. This was why she fought. This was the reward she had been seeking all along, not fame, not power, but the knowledge that her fight had made a real difference in the life of a young person. A life that, without her work, might have been left behind. The realization hit her like a wave. This wasn't just about changing laws or winning battles. It was about the kids, the ones who had no voice, those who had been forgotten.